The main concerns with the extradition treaty is that we'll extradite people to a country where rights are not protected and the access to a fair trial is not available. Furthermore, people are convicted in absentia over in the UAE, and they haven't had a chance to represent themselves in court, but they've been determined guilty regardless, and based on that, they can then be extradited over there, where they won't be able to appeal their sentence. They won't have any sort of representation. They'll just be forgotten about in prison, effectively. And we're hoping to prevent that as much as possible and ensure that some safeguard basic requirements are met before any such treaty is approved.
So what are the advantages for Australia on this treaty?
That is to be determined. The advantages are probably more political than anything. I can't imagine Australia actually looking to extradite many people back here. So I think it's very one-sided in a sense, and I can't see how it's really benefiting Australians at all. A lot of the crimes in the UAE aren't actually crimes in Australia, and therefore that's an issue as well.
And some could argue that the treaty may allow the Australian government to prosecute potential terrorists on UAE soil. Do you think that might be a reason?
That's possible, and I will find out more in Canberra next week. Yes, I suppose there are some incentives in that sense, but I don't think that at any point Australians should be sacrificed for the achievement of that.
Isn't international cooperation such as treaties and so forth essential in order to bring greater respect for human rights in countries like the United Arab Emirates?
I can't see that so much. I mean, we have examples of other countries. The US, for example, would never extradite anyone to the UAE, and it hasn't had any effect on the laws or the way that people are treated over there. Britain does have an extradition treaty, but there's quite a few clauses in there, and people can't be extradited if their human rights are going to be breached. And recently there was a High Court ruling that actually saved someone from being extradited to the UAE based on human rights. So even with a treaty, there doesn't seem to be much benefit, because without the human rights safeguards, it's not an effective treaty anyway, and all it does is tie up years and years of court time and a lot of money of people trying to, prove that the human rights will be breached when it's quite obvious that they will based on quite a number of reports.
What kind of crimes that are committed and punished in the UAE are actually not crimes here in Australia? There's
quite a lot in the business sense, and I'd say this would be the main candidates for extradition would be business people who have actually visited the UAE and invested or operated in business or worked with locals there. There's bounce checks for one, and this is very, very common. It is a criminal offence to bounce a cheque in the UAE, and that's effectively because it's seen as stealing. But the problem is cheques are always used as security. For example, if you rent a car or lease a car for 3 years, you will write out 36 cheques in advance. And if anything happens, for example, you lose your job or circumstances outside your control, the company can then go and present all of those cheques. They can bounce, and you can receive up to 3 years for each cheque, depending on the amount. There are British people and others in jail for bounce cheques, and even though that's not a crime here, and therefore probably the Australian courts wouldn't allow an extradition based on bounce cheques, the problem is the UAE will then report that as fraud rather than bounce checks. So they do upgrade the crimes.
Your organisation, Detained in Dubai, is based in the UK. What kind of treaties does the English government have with countries with a dubious human rights track record like the United Arab Emirates?
Well, they do have extradition treaties, but there are safeguards, as mentioned earlier, mostly based on human rights. Recently, the case of Lodi, where after a 7-year court battle, he was finally declared that it was okay for him to stay and not be extradited based on human rights, which is a good win for a lot of people. And there are a number of people who are concerned that they'll be extradited for things like bounce checks or mortgage defaults. There's all sorts of civil breach of trust, which over there is a criminal offence that's upgraded to fraud. Yes, the UK has a treaty, but there's more protection than the proposed Australian treaty.
What do you think is the way forward?
The way forward in this sense and in this particular issue, I think, is definitely to review the extradition treaty proposal and ensure that there are safeguards for Australians. At this stage, based on my knowledge and experience, a number of Australians who have been caught up in quite nightmarish situations in the UAE, I would have to say that the UAE needs about 10 or 20 years to upgrade their legal system in line with its economic growth. And once we can determine that you can access a fair trial in the UAE, then we could maybe revisit the treaty. But as it stands now, too many innocent people do risk being extradited back to a country whose laws are quite dubious.